constituency should have roughly the same number of voters, although perfection was not required. There's a lot of wiggle room there, Madam Speaker, about what exactly equality of vote means when perfection is not required. And it's that very wiggle room that should make Nova Scotians nervous, that a decision as important as the equality of their vote, when perfection is not required, is going to be made by a select committee out of the light of day of this legislature that has a majority of NDP members on it. That is why the resolution is so offensive in its current form. Madam Speaker, this very principle was tested in the case of the Attorney General of Saskatchewan versus Roger Carter, QC, who argued that it's important that we have clarity about what equality of vote means. And what the decision was in that case, and I'll quote from it, is the purpose of the right to vote enshrined in Section 3 is not equality of voting power per se, but the right to effective representation. This is the big issue, Madam Speaker, because this is fundamentally what the committee is all about, determining that Nova Scotians, each and every one of them, gets effective representation in this House of Assembly. And yet the resolution that the NDP has brought forward, which creates a committee that they are in control of, is going to determine this very important fundamental point enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights out of the light of day of this legislature. And I have a problem with that, Madam Speaker. We'll work on equality of parties and ensuring no party gets an advantage. But what we won't see once it leaves this House, because the committee goes beyond this House, is who has an opinion about what effective representation means. That is the big issue. And who is going to determine it? A committee that has a majority of NDP members. And Madam Speaker, with all due respect, that does not meet any test of fairness that any reasonable Nova Scotian would have and would expect when this House of Assembly takes responsibility for redrawing the electoral boundaries as it is charged to do by the election laws. Madam Speaker, there are other obvious deficiencies in the bill. It's not gone unnoticed that it sets deadlines for the Select Committee to report back. It sets deadlines for the appointment of the Election Commission, but it's actually silent on when the Commission has to report back, something I'm sure that would be very interesting to Nova Scotians to know before their vote needs to be cast in the next election, something they deserve to know so they can test whether their vote is fair and effective and equal to their fellow citizens. But the resolution doesn't even tell them when they're going to find out those important things. But with those few words, Madam Speaker, I will just conclude where I started, that a resolution as important as this, that deals with equality of vote, with effective representation, with fairness, not only for our fellow Nova Scotians, but between political parties, a resolution that should ensure that no one has an advantage. This resolution fails the test in every one of those instances, and that is why we oppose it.
I recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and make a few brief comments on Resolution 1846, which is the Electoral Boundaries Commission Select Committee appointment. Madam Speaker, I had the privilege almost 10 years ago to be part of the Select Committee that did the boundary review back in 2002, was the final report. And I'm pleased that our leader has asked me to once again represent our caucus on the Select Committee as well, which was actually highlighted in the resolution read by the Government House Leader. Madam Speaker, I have to say I found it slightly bizarre to see the apparent tactics of the Conservative caucus as it relates to this specific resolution. But there seems to be a theme that's developing of somehow members of the Progressive Conservative Party want government to be run different than how they ran it for 10 years in this province. You know, I have to say it's not every day that I agree with my good friend, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, but I had to say I found it amusing, his response to the member for Victoria de Lakes who talked about the Celtic Lodge falling apart, and I think the minister indicated unless it started falling apart in the last 2 years, somebody else was in government for the previous 10 years that failed to make investments in that facility. I may have to change my approach here. I was not looking for the approval of the government caucus, I assure you. But, you know, I think it's important that we put a bit of context as to how this process takes place. And unfortunately, I know the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party at one point was Chief of Staff to the Premier. I'm not sure if he was Chief of Staff during the last boundary review. It was a majority Conservative government that set up the Select Committee for the boundary review. And I listened as the leader of the Conservative Party talked about the wonderful debate that took place at that time to talk about equality of vote, to talk about seat counts, to talk about protected ridings, to talk about everything democratic about boundary reviews. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen. What happened was we got notice one day from the then Minister of Justice, the late Michael Baker. It was sent over to us by fax saying, here is the resolution I will read tomorrow on the composition of the Select Committee on Boundary Review. He came the next day, stood in the House, as was done previously, read the resolution, and it was passed. There was no debate. No one talked about the Charter. No one talked about equality of vote. None of that took place. The resolution was passed, and there was no further debate. So let's be realistic here as to what took place. Now, naturally, would we love to see equality on every committee in this House? We would. And we did see it under minority government. Under the previous Conservative majority, we did not see it. They had a majority on every committee there was in the House. When it came to the Select Committee, and every other committee under their majority governments, and every other Select Committee, it was a majority of members from the Conservative caucus, as they had a majority at that time. Our goal as the elected members on that committee is to make sure that the process is open, fair, and transparent. Because at the end of the day, it is not us that should judge as to whether it was done properly, it is Nova Scotians. And it is they that will hold this government accountable if they find in any way that this government used its majority on the Select Committee or on the composition of the Boundaries Commission itself to try to give itself some type of an advantage in the structure of the future boundaries for this province. It is our goal to watch closely how this evolves and to make sure Nova Scotians can say at the end of the day, this process was fair or this process was not fair. That is the goal. At the same time, with all due respect to the leader of the Conservative Party, in the past, the men and women who have served on the Boundaries Commission of Nova Scotia have been very respected Nova Scotians. And unless somehow that process of putting well-respected Nova Scotians on the Boundaries Commission varies by this government, which I doubt, I don't see well-respected Nova Scotians serving on the Boundaries Commission being accused of gerrymandering and being known for their future as having been part of a process that gave a political party in Nova Scotia an advantage. I don't think any of those members would want that to be held over their heads. And so I think that is another safeguard that we have, and we'll watch closely to see who the government appoints as the chair of the Boundaries Commission, whether the other parties will be asked to name representation on that, which I believe was done in the past. Again, with the government having the chair and an appointee and possibly a majority on that as well. But for the most part, the men and women who have served on that have served with distinction. And at the end of the day, I don't think anybody questioned the decisions that they were made. even when it was 10 years ago under a majority Conservative government where they clearly had a majority. You know, I want to point out as well the leader of the Conservative Party has sent mixed messages today because in one sense he said that the previous resolution 10 years ago clearly stated that the Acadian ridings and the riding of Preston were to be protected. That was not so. And I'll tell you why that wasn't so, because the interim report provided by the Boundary Commission 10 years ago recommended that the town of Port Hawkesbury be put in with Richmond, therefore no longer having it as a protected riding. So even though there was some indication in the resolution about trying to maintain protected ridings, in fact, the interim report would have done the exact opposite. Fortunately, at the end of the day, the final report did protect all 4 ridings as they were. That's why putting stuff in a resolution is no guarantee. It's up to us as the elected members, and it's up to Nova Scotians to be watching as to how this process is going to unfold. At the same time, I had the sense that the leader of the Conservative Party was supportive of our protected ridings, yet after reading his case law on equality of vote, I'm not really sure whether he believes in it anymore, because equality of vote, you have to vary it to maintain protected ridings in this province. So I'm not really sure what his position is on this very issue, because he kind of talked out of both sides of his mouth, if I can use that term, Madam Speaker, because I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure, because when he talked about protected ridings and then turned around and started citing charter and case law about equality of vote, they kind of don't jive, and he didn't give a distinction as to what his position would be on that. So that remains to be seen, and maybe the Conservative caucus will advise at some point what their position is. I can tell you that our caucus certainly supports maintaining the protected ridings that we have here in Nova Scotia. I think we should be extremely proud as a province to be able to say that we have highlighted the importance of the Acadian community, of the African Nova Scotian community in this province, and I know there was even an attempt at one point to create a seat for Aboriginal community of Nova Scotia. Obviously, the Aboriginal community decided that they did not want to pursue that option, but that offer was made as a result of the Boundary Commission, I believe 10 years ago, and possibly even the one 20 years ago as well had floated that suggestion as well. So, Madam Speaker, there are changing demographics in our province. Nova Scotians, I believe, expect they will see some changes. It is important that we try to protect communities of interest. I can tell you in the Strait area, we had a situation a few years ago where there was boundaries drawn that put the town of Port Hawkesbury in with Guysborough. That never fit. And I'm sure that the member for Guysborough-Sheet Harbour would acknowledge that. I'm sure the member for Inverness would acknowledge that that just was not a fit. Those communities didn't have the link to be as a provincial riding, and I'm sure the town of Port Hawkesbury is much happier being within the county of Inverness and in the riding of Inverness, which is where they previously were, although at one point there was 2 ridings in the county of Inverness. But those are some of the issues that we'll want to keep in mind. I look forward to seeing exactly how many public meetings are going to be held. I don't believe that information has been provided yet. If I'm not mistaken, the Minister of Justice will be chairing that committee, so I certainly look forward to participating with him in that, and I certainly hope Nova Scotians will engage themselves in this process, and that they will either make submissions or that they will appear in person when public hearings take place, so that when we meet at the end to set forth the guidelines to be used by the Electoral Commission, that we will truly have received positive and meaningful feedback from Nova Scotians as to where they see changes that should be made and where they see areas that should be protected, and any other concerns that they might bring forward. So my final point, Madam Speaker, is that this process is not perfect. There's no real manual that tells you how to do this in a perfect fashion, but it is our goal to try to make sure that while it may not be perfect, that Nova Scotians will have seen this process as being open, transparent, democratic, and not in any way favoring one political party over another. We want to do everything we can to make sure there is equality of vote, looking at some of our special considerations here in Nova Scotia and doing everything we can as legislators, not only to make sure Nova Scotians have good representation, but to make sure Nova Scotians get out, vote, and feel a part of their constituencies and want to play an active role in the democracy that we have here in Nova Scotia. So needless to say, Madam Speaker, in case there was any doubt, our caucus will be supporting this resolution.
I recognize the Honourable Deputy Premier to close debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wish to thank the interveners on this resolution. You know, that one thing the member from Richmond had brought up, that because we were both on the last select committee together, it was myself and the member from Halifax-Chebucto and the member from Cape Breton South, and the majority of the government at the time that were on that were cabinet ministers, I believe. I think they were all but one I think was cabinet ministers. Yeah, but with that said, and we didn't send this like in the last minute. We did advise, and I think it was October 11th, we sent notice to both caucuses this was coming forward. So we knew it was ample time, but in no way did I, on Monday night, when looking for waiver, meant to stifle debate in this House, Mr. Speaker. It was not a means to cut off. It's something, if you remember, in '91, those that were here, that's exactly how it was. But it was after all parties had time to reflect, and if you had differences, then we can debate, and that's fine. I'm not. That's the purpose of this House. But it suffice to say that the leader of the third party's intervention had considerable number of inaccuracies. And I'm not going to dwell on them, but with these few words, Madam Speaker, I close debate on this resolution.
The motion is to adopt Resolution 1816. Is the House ready? Sorry? Yeah, go ahead. Is the House ready for the question? All in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, could you please call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Could you please call Bill number 65, the Nova Scotia Job Funds Act?
I now call Bill number 65, the Nova Scotia Job Fund Act. I recognize the Honourable Member for Preston.
Madam Speaker, could you tell me how much time I have left?
Just give me a moment, please.
That'd be nice.
Thank you. The Honourable Member has 1 hour.
1 hour? That'd be neat.
Excuse me, I'm not. Excuse me,
Madam Speaker,
I will defer to the clerk for a moment, please. Thank you. Can you repeat your question, please, to be clear about what you're asking? How much time do you have remaining?
How much time have I got left to speak on this bill?
How much time do you have left to speak on this? Thank you. In the interest of today's proceedings, I'm going to ask the Honourable Member to begin his debate. We know that there is some time, so we'll advise it in the middle of his debate. So I now recognize the Honourable Member for Preston.
And Madam Speaker, my time will start from now.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I was talking the other day about the dire situation in Nova Scotia with some of the problems that Nova Scotians are facing with the high cost of energy, the high cost of income tax, the burden that's been put on people because of the GST that's been added 2% on people's incomes, and the real result of those things. And I'm just going to reiterate what it means, the 2% GST hike to Nova Scotians. People don't really realize what this is how it's happened. For every $10,000 you clear after taxes, you lose $200 immediately. And I stress after taxes. Now the problem with that is The taxes in this, income taxes in this province are among the highest in the whole country. And every year they go up, every single year. So that $10,000 that you would have cleared 2 years ago or 3 years ago has shrunk. And it shrunk even further because of the 2% GST that's added by this government, this NDP government. So much for a better deal for today's families. More tax, more regulation, and everything you can imagine. And I'll just use one example here that I talked about the other day, how it affects families and businesses. It makes it less competitive for businesses to operate in Nova Scotia, which means less employment for Nova Scotians, is since 2002 to 2009, the compounded rate increase from Nova Scotia Power to all users of power in this province is 36.2%. 36.2%. In other words, for every $100 power bill you used to have in 2002, you're now paying $136.2 more than you were in 2002. That's a drastic increase. A drastic increase. It just shows how non-competitive this province is becoming. And that's a scary statement to make, but it's true. And at the same time, Nova Scotia Power Corporation contributed to Emera, and I was even shocked by this number. I knew there was a lot of money going out. Contributed to Emera. Now think about this, contributed, a non-Nova Scotia company in Emera who has holdings all over the place outside of Nova Scotia, between 2000 and 2010, $1.06 billion. $1.6 billion. $1.06 billion. That's a lot of money gone out of Nova Scotia economy. And that has affected the economy. You see the drastic increases in the price of energy. So when we look at the other energy item that everybody in this province uses, everybody, even if you don't own a property, if you live in an apartment, though, the power rates will affect your rent on the property. But I can tell you, since this government took power, the price of gas has risen 25 cents a litre. 25 cents a litre. And that's a 25% increase. So we have, in that time, 25% increase in gasoline, a 36.2% increase in power. And then the government looks at me and says, this isn't true, the things you're telling me, but they are true. And then we wonder why we've got fewer and fewer companies that want to stay in Nova Scotia. We've got the pulp mill in Port Hawkesbury that's shutting down because of the high cost of doing business here, among other things. We're looking at Bowater that possibly could shut down. We're looking at all the other things that this government is enforcing on the people and the business of this province, to the point that it's not going to be competitive to work here anymore. And it's to that point now, I think. And as this continues, and people start looking, entrepreneurs start looking at a place to set up a business, they're not going to come to Nova Scotia. And those are the people that make the economy grow. Those are the people that make things happen in the province that really do make a difference to ensure that the economy grows. Now, the government has touted the huge deal with the shipyards, a huge deal. Well, I quoted the numbers yesterday, the actual numbers that Irving is saying, and if you look in the peak of this program, there's going to be 1,900 new jobs at the Irving shipyard. And they were quoting 11,500 as a spin-off with all the jobs combined. Well, that may or may not be true. The frigate program, or the program to build the ships here in Nova Scotia, they've neglected to mention that the engines for these ships won't be built in Nova Scotia. They'll be imported. They neglected to mention that the generators in these ships are worth millions and millions of dollars, are only made in one place in the world, and that's in Europe. All the weapon systems on these ships won't be coming from Nova Scotia. So that money will be gone. And the list goes on. And at the same time, in part of the bid process, they have said that they're going to look at other shipyards. outside of Nova Scotia to make sure they get the work done on time. And from a business standpoint, that probably makes sense, especially with the high cost of doing business in Nova Scotia. So when you look at the whole impact of this new thing that's going to save everybody in the province, and that's the way it's been touted, it indeed is a great thing for Nova Scotia. It's a wonderful thing for Nova Scotia. But the problem is that the contract hasn't even been signed yet. Irving has only got the ability to negotiate the contract. It'll probably take another year before this contract will be signed, if indeed the government doesn't change its mind or cut some of their budgets and eliminate some of the money. And then after that is signed, if indeed it is signed, and I stress if indeed it is signed, there's another 2 to 3 years or more to do the design work on the new ships. That means you'll see little or no work done at the shipyards down here for at least 4 to 5 years. And as I said last night in late debate, that's 2 elections away, 2 elections. So what can happen in an election? Programs are canceled, programs are changed. So until this actually gets under construction and a long-term commitment is signed, it's really not a deal that is going to be for sure in Nova Scotia. I truly hope it is. I want to see Nova Scotians working here in Nova Scotia and producing the high-quality products that they do at the shipyards. Now, if you take that same information that was provided by or to government about the spin-offs of this, and you look at the jobs at the 2 pulp mills that are in definite jeopardy, and see the spin-offs of those. Now, if you take approximately, I think someone told me it's around 3,000 jobs could be lost if these pulp mills close. So you're talking about 1,900 jobs, new jobs at the Irving shipyard here, and you're talking 3,000 potential lost jobs. So that's a net loss in jobs. Now, when you look at the pulp mill and see how a pulp mill operates, all the raw materials come from Nova Scotia, and it's harvested here in Nova Scotia, while the steel and a lot of the components that I already talked about will not be produced in Nova Scotia to build these ships. They'll simply be assembled here, tested here, and hopefully someone will be staying in Nova Scotia to operate here in the Naval Yard as they are launched. But when you go through this and see the impact of that, and see the impact of the mills that are here, and you take 1,900 jobs and 3,000, so actually you're going to probably have an impact of probably 15,000 people, without doing the proper math on this, that are going to actually be negatively affected if these sawmills close. So if you're going to put in 4 or 5 years' time, maybe a bit longer, people working at the Irving shipyard, it's a long ways away from a pulp mill that could probably close. One's already closed and one may already be in the process of closing. Hopefully, those won't close, or they'll operate at a different level and at least employ some of the people. So this is what I've been talking about. We've got businesses here that are struggling, the highest power rates in the country, some of the highest corporate taxes in the country, some of the highest thresholds, or the lowest thresholds before you pay corporate tax for small businesses. And these things all add up. It's the nickels and dimes and pennies that make a business grow and prosper. And it's very difficult to make a profit in a small business, very difficult. Then you add the high property taxes that have been imposed on the small businesses by the municipalities that are struggling to try to keep their infrastructure together. And I met with a lot of them, and they have a lot of issues with infrastructure, and find that the MOU that this government canceled with the municipalities has indeed a negative impact on municipalities. And I talked the other day about that, and the HRM is going to be close to 44 million over a very short period of time. So what does that mean? It means property taxes will increase. Property taxes increase, the cost of doing business in Nova Scotia increases. And with HRM being the center at the present time of industry, a lot of industry in Nova Scotia, and a lot of businesses in Nova Scotia, it will negatively affect them. And then if HRM decides not to do that, if they decide not to do that, and they decide, well, we'll cut the services, so where do they cut? They're already running to the limit. They can't maintain the facilities they already have, the community centers, and all the other ones. I know that for a fact from being on council. So where do they get the money from? So it's either eliminate service or raise taxes or do both. And 44 million, even to HRM's budget, is a significant hit. When you go to the small municipalities that are struggling, absolutely struggling, to get the services provided. And this government come along and they said, well, we're going to cancel the MOU, but you have to improve from the Department of Environment your treatment systems. And one municipality told me today that it was $44 million a year they're going to have to spend on this. They don't have $44 million a year to do this. So where do they get the money again? Raise taxes or cut services? And the government said, well, this MOU won't have any effect. It is definitely having a bad effect on the economy. And when you add all these things up and you put them all together, the average individual in this province has less money to spend. A better deal for today's families. Well, I don't know where the better deal is. It sure isn't here. And I see these signs. I talked about these before, and they're so annoying. Here we are, we're cutting money at healthcare, education, the places we need it, and great big signs up that the Premier and the Minister of Transportation and the Premier and some other minister is doing this wonderful job for Nova Scotia. Costs a fortune to build these plywood signs, a fortune to put them up. I would like to know from this government exactly how many hundreds of thousands of dollars it costs for these signs. They're political signs and no other way to put it. They're political signs that try to make people think that really something positive is happening. And I can tell you, when I see people in my constituency office that are losing their homes because they can't pay the property taxes, so many people from all the communities I represent are having difficulty paying their power bills. Power bills. They're having trouble paying all the bills they have. And it's largely to do with the high increase in all the fuel costs we've seen. The regulation, nobody talks about this too much. Regulation on gasoline costs $1 to $3 million a year. Where's that money come from? The people that drive. And it's on diesel fuel too. So every time a truck moves in Nova Scotia and they have to buy diesel fuel here, it costs them more. So what do? They got to put the freight cost up. You see the price of groceries go up because of the freight costs. And the cost to operate these large stores. So when you add the power bills and the increased property taxes they have to put in place, Nova Scotia is not a place that is amenable for business. Now they talk about this new bill that's going to be this Nova Scotia Jobs Fund Act that's going to save everything, right? It's just a new name for the old IEF fund. The cabinet and supposedly slush fund. That's what the members of the NDP said when they weren't in government, but they have yet to show that it's any different than the Tories did when they were in. So, you know, when you add all these things together and see what's going on here, it's a serious situation for Nova Scotians. And, you know, there's so many issues about this that make a difference and make it difficult for here. And with just my last few minutes I have here, I really want to talk again about the negative impact on business. Now, people think that businesses can pay for everything and do everything, and they can do all these things. And it's true, businesses can contribute a lot to the economy. And as this progresses, the trouble with businesses are they've got to have a favorable climate to work in. In other words, they've got to have many, many things. They've got to have a skilled workforce. They've got to have reasonable tax rates. They've got to have markets. They have to have facilities. They have to communications and all those things. Well, we do have the communication systems now. We do have a relatively well-trained workforce, one that could be trained better. We have a very regressive tax system, very regressive, a system that is going to eventually cause serious grief for this province. And you know, as people start to realize, I can't spend as much money as I had, that most people don't really realize what's happened to them, because you pay a couple of cents on this or $1 more on that and $2 or $3 more on that, and then all of a sudden you don't have that money that you needed last year, that you had last year or the year before, to buy the tank of oil you need to get you through the winter. And I get tons of calls, people looking for oil or firewood, whatever they can get to heat their homes. And they don't have the money to upgrade their homes to make sure it's more energy efficient to resolve that problem. So the whole system just collapses over time. And it takes a long time for people to realize where this is coming from. But I can tell you, I'm going to remind them. I'm going to continue to remind them about the tax increases, about how it's cost them more money to live in Nova Scotia, more money to operate a business in Nova Scotia, and making them, businesses in particular, non-competitive. Non-competitive business means they don't employ as many people. People aren't employed, they can't pay the bills. And as I've said before, we've got way too much government in this province, way too much, with a very high percentage of all the jobs in the province in government. Now, government employees are very, very important people. They do a lot of very good things and help a lot, but they don't add new money into the economy. Only businesses that produce products that are exported out of Nova Scotia or prevent an import coming into Nova Scotia really add money. And we've talked here about tourism over and over again. This cancellation of the Yarmouth Ferry has a devastating effect on the tourism operators, even in my area. Now, I don't have a lot of them, but everyone I have has been telling me the same thing. Our revenue is down. The minister told us last year this would have no effect at all, absolutely none. Everything would be wonderful and the tourism industry would still grow. When the numbers come in, that wasn't the case. It's dropped, and it's dropped drastically. So why would someone come here and spend money on Nova Scotia if you're in the U.S. and you're paying 85 or 86 cents a litre for fuel, and here you're paying $1.25? Think about that. Think about it. It just doesn't make any sense. Their dollar was okay one time when the dollar was higher than ours, but now it doesn't make sense. Plus, their economy is in a hard shape, and they're spending more money at home. But if we're not competitive and we can't put the services out there that we need to ensure that people have a job here that they can make good money at. But if you don't have an environment where business is competitive and can be competitive outside of Nova Scotia, we're not going to survive here, we're not going to prosper here, and we're not going to do the things we want to see our children do. And so many young people have moved out of the province and out of the country even to secure jobs. And a lot of those people are the brightest and best we have. And those are the young people that really make this economy grow in the province and make things go and make things prosper here. This province is not prospering now. It won't prosper in the future under the present regime. The NDP has many regressive acts they put forward. Bill 100 was a very regressive act. They're talking about putting another arbitration bill in here, which would be very regressive to business. And it's going to be very, very difficult for people to operate here. And as this goes on, it's going to take many, many, many years to sort it out. You can only spend so long. If the interest rate goes up in this province will be bankrupt. That's simple. That's simple. And this government over here added a tremendous amount to the debt. They may say no, they didn't, but they did. So it's very difficult and very disappointing for me to see how this province is going really in the wrong direction, and indeed very soon there won't be jobs for Nova Scotians. Thank you.
Thank you. If I'm to recognize the Honourable Minister for Economic and Rural Development, it will be to close debate.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
It appears that we have a member from the Progressive Conservative Party that was prepared to speak but was not up. So if with the Minister's indulgence, I'd like to give him that opportunity.
Yes.
Thank you. I now recognize the Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for being gracious. I was completing my remarks, and my diligence was not right off the mark when I should have been. Madam Speaker, the Industrial Expansion Fund was started by Stanfield, and a great premier for our province, and it's been valuable for government to have a mechanism to respond to special situations, which maybe have opportunities to grow our economy. And I think of a couple of examples. We have Scott Paper, which is now Northern Pulp. Think of Michelin, which we spoke about today in the legislature, which employs, I heard a figure today of upwards of 3,500 people in our province. And that came about because of the vision of Stanfield and the need to have a fund like the Industrial Expansion Fund. And I do remember hearing a bit about Michelin, and the owner from France at the time was looking for a population, because we know they have plants all over the world. They were looking for a plant location which would have a lot of people who are good to work with their hands. And Nova Scotia fit the bill because we had lots of farmers and fishermen and miners, some of who were being displaced from work in those industries. And today, of course, we have many skilled people in Nova Scotia who work at Michelin, making tires that are distributed all over the world. So the Industrial Expansion Fund, Madam Speaker, I believe has been a good thing for our province. And one thing about that fund is that it was done with criteria at the time. And that was important, that there were clear criteria on how you could access the fund and how it was evaluated. Now, the minister has recognized that, he says that he recognized that the 1950s model for economic development could not be adapted to meet today's growing needs. But, Madam Speaker, I don't think a lot has changed. At the end of the day, what this fund is about, it's about finding a way to support a business opportunity and to do it in a manner that's flexible, because sometimes opportunities come to government, maybe because they're very large opportunities, that do not fit in the box of existing programs. So it's important for government to have a tool at its disposal to be able to accommodate those opportunities to ensure that we realize them. Now, I have heard a most relevant case made by Nova Scotia small business. Excuse me if I'm generalizing, but I think that they would agree with the spirit of this statement, that make one program of support with the same rules for all. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And when you look at the case of some of the failures of the past Industrial Expansion Fund, and yes, there have been failures, because that's the nature of business. And while we'd all hope, and anybody who starts a business in this province would hope that that business would be successful, there are times when, because of competition, that cannot be so. And that is a reality. And so I certainly support small business in Nova Scotia when they make that suggestion that there should be one program for all and that it should have the same rules for all. But there are times when there are special situations. And I don't think it would be wise of government to completely close the door on opportunities which it may be able to support with an Industrial Expansion Fund. Another thing I'd like to say about Nova Scotia small business is that we should be focused on trying to help them add 1 or 2 employees, or 5 or 10 employees, or 10 or 20 employees.
Order, please. The chatter's getting a little high. If we can offer the honourable member for Inverness the floor. Thank you.
There's great, and I think this is interesting. The Minister of Finance doesn't think this is interesting, but I think this is a very interesting point. Helping small business in Nova Scotia grow by helping Nova Scotia small business grow, even by small numbers, it makes a significant difference in our economy. And it also gives us more stability. We're less subject to what people might call a black swan. There was a belief at one time there were no black swans in the world. And then people discovered that there in fact were. And this day and age, we're seeing more of them. And when I say more of them, I mean in the sense of more extreme events that affect our economy. And if you look at it in the example I've just given, in the case of small business, by finding ways to increase their numbers incrementally, even in small amounts, we're warding off against putting all our eggs in one basket in large industry. But I do believe there is still a place for the IEF. And I spoke to one prominent businessman in this province who's been very successful, and he has the philosophy, and I think he makes a lot of sense, that government should be helping to form economic bases around the province and let small business feed off of that and grow off of that base. And we look at the case of NewPage in the Strait area right now. If you look at all the truckers, the pulp contractors, and the equipment suppliers, and sadly, Madam Speaker, if you look at the list of creditors for that mill right now, Now, here's a case of an industry that's brought tremendous wealth into the province. There's no question that the demand for paper has declined, but there's an enormous amount of people who have been making their living directly or at least partially right around the province. And take a look at the list of creditors, the people who are owed money. There's companies all over this province. And you know, there's industries like the pulp and paper industry, like I know Scott Paper for sure has in the past. Now Northern Pulp has received support from the Industrial Expansion Fund. And that is, you know, look at all the people that's helping, and look at all the small business that's helping. But Madam Speaker, I am worried more than ever about the health of our rural economies in this province. And I do believe that our hubs are in jeopardy, and certainly in my own area, the Strait area, our hub is in jeopardy. There are people from an hour's distance drive from Point Tupper, whether they be in Guysborough County, Richmond County, Inverness County, Victoria County, Antigonish County, and into the Pictou counties that are driving in to work at that pulp mill or supplying it with what it needs to operate. And you know, I've heard comments. I've heard comments that you know, gee, we really need another paper mill, or we should really be trying to put stock in that paper mill at this stage in the game. I've heard it from people here in the city, and I think you know, it's almost as if it's some kind of a handout. But you know, when you look at the amount of wealth that that pulp mill and paper mill has brought into this province since the 1960s, it's amazing. And it's money that's been brought into our economy, and it's reverberated all across our province. And you might be surprised, Madam Speaker, but in Inverness County, we have the 4th largest income per capita in the province, which might seem strange for a rural area, but it's because of the pulp mill. And it's because of that investment. And but I am concerned about rural areas of the province. I just look at a lot of my friends who have moved on. I just had to pull out an old yearbook to, well, it can't be that old, I guess. But if I pull out a yearbook and look at who's left our communities from my school, there's very few people left in that yearbook that are still around home. And so, Madam Speaker, you know, when I look at this Industrial Expansion Fund, it's really been the go-to to assist large industry in the province. And I think it should continue, along with competitive tax rates, power rates that are affordable, that are based on good energy policy. And, you know, this fund that we've been asked to vote for, I believe that it should have clear criteria and benchmarks and transparent reporting. And we don't see how these components are contained in the actual legislation. There don't appear to be any changes of any substance between the legislation that governed the Industrial Expansion Fund and this new proposed fund. We also have a concern about the farm and aquaculture loan boards, which have up until this point been independent and specialized to serve those industries. We're curious to hear what people in those industries would think about having their traditional lending arms being housed under this new arrangement. Now, we would support modifications to the Industrial Expansion Fund that would include clear application criteria so that anybody applying to the fund understands how to do so and what the rules are. We would want to have transparency on why projects receive support and performance measurement. How can we improve government investment if we never look back to see how our past investment has done? So at the end of the day, the government is going to be responsible for its investments, depending on the success or failure of the enterprise. But these modifications are ones we would support. We also wonder what the Auditor General will have to say about these changes once they're enacted. This bill that we've been asked to vote for does not appear to address the issues of the Auditor General, but rather only changes the fund's name, increases the control of Cabinet over arm's-length bodies such as Nova Scotia Business Inc., and includes a very broad objective with no measurements for success. Now, just because you have a pot of money and call it the Jobs Fund, it doesn't mean you've created the right business climate in Nova Scotia to create jobs. We've seen 5,000 fewer jobs in this province, 5,000 lost jobs since this government has come to power. We've seen taxes go up, power rates have gone up. Now, not entirely because of energy policy of the government. Some of that is due to the rising cost of energy inputs. But some of it, and according to Nova Scotia Power, 25% of the increases are due to the government's energy policy. That's not good for business, Madam Speaker. It's not good for creating jobs in the province. And no matter what the government is trying to do with this new fund, those are factors that are going to impair its ability to create jobs and to replace the 5,000 that we've lost in the last 2 years. There's been a lot of talk of, I think I'll skip that point. I'm going to try to go a little easier on the government today, Madam Speaker. Well, maybe I will. Maybe I will. We talked about the shipbuilding contract. You know, and I know my colleague from Preston made a good point about, you know, if we lose the paper mills in our province, these shipbuilding jobs are only going to fill the void those jobs leave, so there's really no net benefit. Well, we don't want to be negative, but you know what? We have to be realistic about our economy, and if we're not paying attention, we have to be realistic about power rates. If we're not paying attention to our energy policy and we're causing power rates to increase by 25% more than they have to, and we're hurting energy-intensive business like paper mills in the province, and we lose those jobs, we have to be, well, 20 years ago, we probably would have lost the pulp mills 20 years ago then. Well, we would have. If you went to wind energy at that time, if you went to tidal energy at that time, they're still trying to figure out tidal energy now, and I wish them all the best. But, Madam Speaker, we're not ready for that. And if we did that 20 years ago, we could have shut the mills 20 years ago. So we have to be realistic. I don't want to be negative, but I do want the government to start listening, because these are real issues. Energy is a big issue. It's a big issue everywhere. And we need to pay attention to it here if our policies are going to make business less competitive. But to the point that I was about to leave out and decided, based on my colleague's advice, to include it, we saw the federal NDP say, spread that shipbuilding contract around. Now, thank God the federal government decided to keep politics out of the matter, and our province benefited from full value of a $25 billion contract. So, bringing it back, and I hope they do, and I take the Minister of Economic Development's word on that will be spread around the province. And I know companies like Mulgrave Machine Works, which is not in my riding, but right on the border, and people who work there, I know they're going to receive, I'm sure they'll receive business, because that's the nature of their work. And we want to be positive about that in this province. I'm looking forward to the economic benefits trickling into Inverness County. But I hope they will be augmenting our existing economy, because, of course, I hope that New Page is able to resume operations under a new owner. Now, the one thing that, you know, that it amuses me is because I know when you're in opposition, you have to make complaints about the government, because you have to discredit them. But now, now the members opposite are counseling me not to do such a thing. And life is about choices. Yes, it is. But it amuses me. It amuses me because the government members, when they're in opposition, used to rail against the then Conservative government for investments they were making under the Industrial Expansion Fund. Now, in the first year, this government spent $221 million under that program. And in their first year, that was in their first year, and when they were questioned by the Auditor General about the accountability of that expenditure, they decided to launch a rebranding of the same fund. So I just want to point that out. Now, the minister also mentioned in his remarks last spring, he referred to a new cabinet committee being the beginning of transparency and accountability for the fund. And I don't see the connection between this new bill and any requirement for open reporting, transparency, or additional accountability. Now, maybe I will be surprised. Maybe I'll be surprised. Now, Madam Speaker, this is about where I got to in my speech, so I haven't really been able to put on a formal closure to it. But we do have concerns about really what we're being asked to vote on here. Is it really that much different? We do, I think I should get back to the highlights of it. We certainly support clear application criteria. We support transparency on projects and why they've received support. We certainly support performance measurement. And we do recognize that at the end of the day, no matter, even if all of this is in place, much like it's been since the 1950s, this is still a tool that government's going to use, and they'll be judged on it based on the success or failure of the venture. So, Madam Speaker, and that's good. I'm glad he's not, and that shows that there has been value to the Industrial Expansion Fund, and that's what I've been trying to convey in my remarks today as well. So, with that, Madam Speaker, I will conclude my remarks.
I now recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased today to get up, say a few words, and join the debate on a piece of legislation that really doesn't change too much in the way business will be conducted here in the province as far as the IEF goes. You know, I was very, very hopeful when the Auditor General did his report, because as we know, in late 2009, when he was doing his audit of the Industrial Expansion Fund, he ran into a situation that no Auditor General, in fact, had encountered before, and that was he was stymied in his work. He wasn't provided with the information that he required to do an audit. And it was in this context that the Auditor General began to look at the IEF. And at that time, he said, the IEF has few processes, controls, or documentation to support the review and evaluation of applications for loans or other assistance. The only substantial documentation consists of confidential reports to Cabinet, and this enhances the risk of inconsistent or inequitable treatment of applicants, inaccurate or incomplete analysis and recommendations, and poorly informed decisions. A recently established advisory committee has no oversight role. Confidential Cabinet review and approval is the only significant control or oversight of this program. So now we have a piece of legislation before us that in effect, is titled Nova Scotia Jobs Fund Act, which we know in its, if we look at the nature of the bill and looking for substantive change, I think we don't need to do much analysis and scrutiny to realize, in fact, that it still remains a secretive political slush fund controlled by Cabinet. And really, the Auditor General pointed the way, and he said Nova Scotia Business Inc. Has all the credentials, has the professional expertise, it has people with a business history, those that have been dealing with international companies, know the trends and patterns that are happening globally in order to attract business to Nova Scotia. And the Auditor General pointed government in that direction, that in fact Nova Scotia Business Inc. would become the arm's-length body to take a look at the kind of decisions that allow for strong and investment that has a great chance of success in the province. So what we have now is in fact a name change, And we know that cabinet ministers will still control a substantial amount of money. In fact, an amount of money that has grown again to great amounts in the last 2 years. So cabinet should have really not the final say here. I know that they can draw upon the Department of Economic and Rural Development, but again, to have this large group of people who bring a great business sense to the table is really the kind of business decision and not a political decision, because at the end, the cabinet is making a political decision. Now, the IEF goes back to the 1950s and has always been used by cabinet to hand out cash to their favorite business. And we have seen this through all governments. I'm not here defending how my party conducted itself in regards to the IEF. It's just that I think the climate in Nova Scotia for a new approach is very, very strong. And I think in this case, to be submissive about what the Auditor General pointed out, and in fact a path of action to correct is very much the way that we need to be going. And in some ways, I guess, we can sum it up almost in one neat little sentence. The fund ballooned under the McDonald government and exploded under the Dexter NDP. That's exactly what's happened to the IEF. That's exactly what's happened to the IEF. So in his report in May, the Auditor General, Jacques Lapointe, concluded the fund had no application system and no documented approval process, and really had inadequate controls and needed to change direction. Now, the bill as we currently see it, unless we're going to get some major amendments as we go along, but we know that doesn't have to be the case under majority, this bill is not going to change the direction around the IEF. So in March of 2010, Leader of the Opposition presented Bill number 6. And a section of the bill speaks directly to the fact that this is simply the same slush fund by a different name. The Industrial Expansion Fund, established under the former Industrial Development Act, has continued for the purpose of this act as a special account in the Office of the Deputy Minister of Finance, to be known as the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund. And this is a symptom, really, of a larger issue, that perhaps without that 5-year plan or even a 10-year plan as to how you're going to develop a business strategy, a development strategy for the province, then you have the ad hoc manner in which monies are divvied out. And so I think that's really at the crux of why Nova Scotians don't like the direction of this bill. And I think it does now speak very, very strongly with the present climate that we're experiencing in the province. And we've had a number of MLAs allude to this, whether through question period, whether through commentary on this bill today. We live in a very uneasy business climate in our province. And I know for a fact that when we take all of the factors together, the uncompetitive tax regime, the high energy cost, and the general cost of doing business in the province here, we know that both large and small businesses are struggling. And this is why having an IEF fund that remains as a handout to favored businesses, large or small, but we tend to see them going mostly to the large business sector, is indeed problematic for Nova Scotians. And establishing perhaps even as a screening body with the Nova Scotia Business Inc., made up of some of the top people, the very successful business people, those able to make tough and hard-nosed decisions, becoming a panel that scrutinizes where our money goes, to hopefully lay the groundwork for jobs in the future, and again, a sustainable pattern of industry that we so need for the future of our province. And while we all bask in the wonderful announcement of the shipbuilding contract, we do have to look beyond that as well, because we have to look at the entire province of Nova Scotia. That's going to be wonderful, and it's going to provide those steady jobs, professional jobs, but again, it's only part of the measure that we need, especially in a province that has so many wonderful academic institutions. We have to find ways of taking those innovative minds, those brilliant minds, and getting them to work in our province. And I think incenting young people with ideas, rather than have a fund that gives out money in so many cases historically, decisions by cabinet that have not multiplied those investment dollars, and this is why again, rather than an industrial expansion fund, if we had a small business expansion fund, we may be going down a much stronger path of good financial security, higher employment, and a sustainable economy. I see in my area where sometimes the private investment in agriculture in particular, and how those dollars circulate many times through the economy, and create good jobs that are there year after year after year. Although we know that, again, on the manufacturing side, due to the uncompetitive nature of what it costs to produce a product, if you have to use a great deal of electricity to do so, we've also been impacted in the area where I live, and we've lost close to now 3,000 jobs in the manufacturing of agriculture products. So we do need some new thinking around how we take millions of dollars and invest. And I think what we're talking about, doing this comprehensive tax review and getting a look at where we can take taxes wisely for the province, and take ourselves out of that league of being the most highly taxed province in the country, I think would be a step in the right direction. And this would get businesses freely looking at Nova Scotia as a place to invest. But unless we do something in that way, we're going to be saddled, with the kind of economic climate that we currently have in the province. And so we need a new approach to economic development. And we need a fair playing field for businesses in the province, for the larger business, but even more importantly for the medium and small business. And the business for which most Nova Scotians work for, We know that probably about 75% of Nova Scotians work in small business. And I've been able to see perhaps some of the best examples. We look at a business investor and developer in my area, such as Henry Andres and the Annapolis Valley peat bog, the Annapolis Valley cranberry bog, where he has taken almost exclusively private money and has quadrupled his workforce, has dramatically changed the number of acres that he is now farming, and seeing those jobs there year after year after year, because before he ever, built a storage facility that can handle, 1 million pounds or more of cranberries, he sought out markets. He went to Europe, and he did the whole business practice and process that is so important. We look at somebody like, Ray Parsons, who took, a 3 or 4 person construction company to one now that moves across Nova Scotia with highly qualified workers. Again, very strongly his own investment dollars. So these are the people that we need to call upon to assist with making good business decisions and take this away from Cabinet. And I think Cabinet would, in fact, look even stronger by allowing these people to make good investment decisions. And so it'll be interesting if we do hear from Nova Scotians as we move this bill through the legislature on what they will have to say and how they perceive the IEF working or not working to the greatest advantage of Nova Scotians. It's their dollars, and I think they want to see, greater, outcomes for the next generation of Nova Scotians. So, the one-offs that seem to continually come out of the IEF, have not given us the kind of, good-paying jobs consistently. Yes, there have been some investments there that are doing very well, but the track record, again, is not what it needs to be when we're using the taxpayer dollar. So, Madam Chair, it'll be interesting to see what Nova Scotians have to say, and perhaps there will be some change and amendment as this bill works its way through the legislature. And with that, Madam, I take my place.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak a few words on Bill number 65, which is the old Industrial Expansion Fund, now known as the Nova Scotia Job Funds Act. Madam Speaker, having been in the legislature since 1998 gives me a bit of memory as to some of the debates which took place around this fund. And I remember, just for the information of some of my colleagues in the PC caucus, ironically none of them that I see here today would have been elected back then. But in the 1999 campaign, John Ham said, we need to put a stop to handing out money to business in Nova Scotia. Wow. He was openly critical of the previous Liberal government, giving money to the Industrial Expansion Fund and through other means to support business growth in the province. He ran a campaign on that he would stop that practice. 1999. John Ham got elected, PCs had a majority, and I have to say, They couldn't go fast enough to write their first check, and they never looked back. They used the Industrial Expansion Fund repeatedly, even after having campaigned on saying they would abolish it, and they would abolish supports to business. Then they got cute, and they came back and said, well, we're going to start these payroll rebates. So it's not direct money to them, but it's still supporting them. Well, we all know that payroll rebates is an initiative that started when the member from Cape Breton South was the Minister of Economic Development under the previous Liberal government. I believe now the Conservatives will actually acknowledge that it was not their idea. It was actually a practice that had been in place, and they expanded upon it and used it more frequently. In fact, it's still being used today by the current NDP government. So Tories didn't like it, said they'd get rid of it, got elected, majority government, never looked back, used the fund repeatedly, pumped a bunch of money into it, and kept writing checks to support business. So that takes us from 1999 to 2009. And during those 10 years, we listened to the official opposition, which was the NDP, say how bad the Industrial Expansion Fund was. We listened over and over and over again to the member for Halifax Fairview, the finance critic. And Madam Speaker, I don't have in front of me all of the quotes from Hansard, but some have been referenced before, and I'm sure they will be referenced again, of how critical the member for Halifax Fairview was of the Industrial Expansion Fund, the secret around the fund, the fact that Cabinet controlled it, the fact that Nova Scotia taxpayers deserve better transparency. So one has to ask, was the member for Halifax Fairview at any point put in a position where he could change these things that he had so criticized? Well, we now know in 2009 the NDP won a majority government. Now what did they do? As soon as they got in office, they put more money in the fund, and they started spending and writing checks from the fund, which led us to ask, well, hold on now, what happened to everything the member for Halifax Fairview said in opposition? He sounded serious when he said it. I can tell you, having been in the House, he said it often enough that those of us who are here haven't forgotten. Yet, he's now the Minister of Finance after the 2009 election. Surely, he is the one person that is going to clean up the Industrial Expansion Fund, make it transparent, and stand up to the criticisms that he made in opposition and put in new fund. Well, the Minister of Economic Development says he cleaned up the fund, but at the end of the day, any monies spent by the government comes from the Minister of Finance. So considering his criticisms, one would have thought that this bill would have provided the transparency, the accountability, and the assurance to Nova Scotians that their tax dollars are being spent wisely and in a prudent fashion. Madam Speaker, I believe the public reaction, the reaction in this House, the reaction in the media from those who have watched, is this bill does not do that. This bill rebrands the naming, but at the end of the day, Cabinet will still control this fund, and Cabinet will make decisions in the Cabinet room, where there's Cabinet confidentiality, where we don't have access to the documents that Cabinet is looking at. Having had the privilege of serving in Cabinet, I know how it works. And that certainly doesn't provide the transparency that the member for Halifax Fairview, now the Finance Minister, was looking for. So I'm not sure here if it's the fact that the Minister of Finance lost this battle, that he fought the good fight, but at the end of the day he was overruled by Cabinet. Because we don't know what Cabinet discussions take place, we have no means of knowing. Maybe some of his colleagues can confirm whether he tried and he failed, or whether it was an attempt at all. We don't know. He certainly hasn't publicly said a word about it since the NDP formed government. And that's, I think, Madam Speaker, and I've spoken about this before, and I think that's where not only Nova Scotians, but especially core NDP supporters have been so disappointed in what this government has done. Because all along, they truly and sincerely believed this government would do things differently. They really believed that. They really did believe that. And some of us, I would say, we're watching to see maybe they are going to do things completely differently. At the end of the day, they haven't. This government is governing like other governments and other parties have done in this province. And they are now governing in the hopes of being able to be re-elected. I would say that that is the primary focus of the decisions that they make, is being re-elected, not necessarily doing exactly what's right. Because if they were, they would look back at some of the comments that were made by the member for Halifax Fairview, the Chronicle Herald, November 17, 2005, where they reported, quote, when it comes to the Industrial Expansion Fund, it seems like anything goes, end quote. Now the Minister of Finance. Another quote from the Chronicle Herald on April 6, 2006 says, quote, the problem here is that government can allocate itself a very large amount of money, in this case 50 million, without ever informing the House, without requiring the approval of the House, without any accountability to the House. That can't be right, and the Auditor General has said so, end quote. So, one has to ask, what does Bill 65 have to do with addressing the very concerns raised by the member for Halifax Fairview, now the Minister of Finance? The answer is absolutely nothing. It does not provide the transparency or the accountability that he was looking for. Decisions are still made in Cabinet, decisions are still made in secret, and Nova Scotians are left to trust the decisions made behind closed doors as to how their tax dollars are being invested. Madam Speaker, I have a few more comments to make on this bill, but it's my understanding that there has been a request for an introduction, which I am more than happy to allow to take place.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member from Guysborough Sheet Harbour on an introduction.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for colleague from Richmond for his indulgence. I'd like to bring the House attention to the East Gallery, where we have Mayor Frank Fraser from the Town of Council visiting this afternoon. Mayor Fraser is attending the UNSM conference, and he is certainly no stranger to this House. Mayor Fraser has been here on many occasions for the opening of the House and has always taken a keen interest in what takes place here in this legislature, and certainly what takes place within all of Nova Scotia, especially the area that he represents. So I asked the House to give Mayor Fraser a warm welcome.
I welcome all guests. Hope you enjoy the proceedings. Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I certainly welcome Mayor Fraser here this evening as well. I know there's a number of colleagues, municipal colleagues from Richmond County who are here as well. So, as I was saying, when one looks at the comments made by the member for Halifax Fairview, now the Minister of Finance, I do believe there's a responsibility to be able to tell Nova Scotians what has changed and why. Now that he's Minister of Finance, technically he controls any expenditures made by government. Why would he not have addressed the very issues that he spoke of so frequently in opposition? His silence on this, to me, Madam Speaker, speaks of a larger problem of what the current government said while they were in opposition. And we've given many of those examples. This bill deals with economic development and the economy, and I want to talk as well, make mention of when the Premier was in opposition, when he talked about the tax structure for gasoline in this province, the tax on tax, he said it was immoral, an immoral tax. Yet 2 years into his mandate, he hasn't changed it. Why hasn't he changed it? Because he now realizes we need that money for the finances of this province. I would have thought, as a minimum, that he would have said, I regret the comments I made in opposition against the previous government when I said that tax was immoral, or suggested they were immoral by having that tax, because now that I'm in government, I see that I can't change it either. And I think that would have been the decent thing to do, to say, you know what, I criticized it, I said they should have done it, I thought they should do it, I felt they could do it, and yet here I am 2 years into my mandate, and I haven't been able to do it either, so I take back my comments. But that hasn't happened, and I think that's what the core NDP supporters and many Nova Scotians thought would be different about this government, that they would be able to say, you know what, we thought we could change this, but we can't. And our criticisms before maybe were not fair because of the fact that now that we're here and we see the books, we can't make it different. Not yet, at least. And this is another example of so much criticism made by the NDP in opposition about the Industrial Expansion Fund. And now 2 years in, we had the sad situation of this government preventing the Auditor General from being able to have access to applications made and documents from the Industrial Expansion Fund. And the government came back and said, well, legally we can't. The Minister of Finance said, we'll have to change the law because the law doesn't allow us to do it. And it's ironic because the Minister of Finance, when he was in opposition, was known for the number of court cases that he led to try to improve access to information, to try to fight against government rules and regulations that were impacting Nova Scotians negatively. And yet here he is now in government, the ability to make it right. And instead he says, no, we have a legal opinion telling us we can't allow the Auditor General to look at these documents. What did they think the Auditor General was going to do? That he was going to publish? That he was going to publish this information? What were they afraid of? At the end of the day, a determination was made, a political determination was that they had to keep this fund. And they had to keep it under the control of Cabinet. Our leader has brought forward, I believe, a positive solution when he said, we trust the NSBI, Nova Scotia Business Incorporated. We trust the civil servants who work there. They are governed by a board of respected Nova Scotia business leaders and academics. We are going to allow them to make decisions as to how investments should be made of Nova Scotia taxpayers' money. I've yet to hear the Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism or any other minister of this government say why that's a bad idea. Why don't they trust those monies with NSBI? What is it that they still feel the need to make decisions in secrecy when it comes to taxpayers' dollars? So, Speaker, that's what gets governments in trouble. Because we'll recall, under previous Tory government, they got in trouble when they had approved a loan to a company that was doing business with a cabinet minister. Then we had the situation where a loan was approved for a business in the Premier's riding that was of questionable value, and it was questionable whether it actually fit into the parameters of the funding system that we had in place. And we had both of those come before public accounts. It was a great embarrassment to the government of the day. It certainly made us aware of the need to be more vigilant in watching where government was investing money. But it shouldn't have to be that way. Why is it that Cabinet still feels the need to control these funds and that all of these discussions are done in secret? Now, Madam Speaker, we're reasonable people in the opposition. One would not suggest that the application submitted by Nova Scotia businesses should be made public. There's information in there about their business that they would want to keep confidential due to competition and various other issues. But at the same time, I believe businesses know when you're coming to ask for money from government, you cannot expect the same level of privacy that you would have from going to a private bank. So now, how can we manage to balance the concerns over privacy that businesses deserve, over the concerns of making sure there's transparency in how Nova Scotia taxpayer dollars are invested? This bill does nothing to address that very issue. It absolutely fails to address that issue because the discussions will continue to take place behind closed doors. They'll be done by the appointed cabinet of elected members of the government, and they will make that decision. Their discussions, as we all know, falls under cabinet confidentiality and can never be disclosed. So Nova Scotians are again left to wonder, are we investing into something that is good for our province, that is a good deal, and that protects taxpayers' dollars? That's not in this bill. Again, I haven't heard the minister or anyone else on the government side explain why they still feel the need to have cabinet controlling it. And maybe there is a reason outside of politics. There might be. But let someone stand on the government side and give us that explanation. Maybe it is a legitimate reason as to why they feel that need, but I'd love to hear that from the Minister of Finance. Because again, maybe then he would be able to say to the previous governments that he was so critical of that, I'm sorry, I made comments against your use of those funds that I am now defending that our government will continue to do. But up till now, he has remained silent on this very topic and left it to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development to try to explain the difference between the IEF and this new bill. At the end of the day, the Minister is on record as having said, for the most part, it's going to operate the same way as the previous fund. He's changed the name, but for all intents and purposes, it's going to operate the same way. Again, as I mentioned before, I simply want to highlight that I've yet to hear anyone in government explain why the proposal put forward by our leader to have these funds controlled by NSBI doesn't work. Now, the old argument used to be, well, the IEF and now the new bill, which we'll call the Nova Scotia Job Funds Act, that it can do stuff that NSBI couldn't do. Well, there's a simple way around that. Change the criteria around what can be done by NSBI to better reflect some of the challenges that they're facing in not being able to provide funding to certain partners that Cabinet can. Because if Cabinet can approve it, why would you not allow NSBI to be able to take these requests into consideration as well? That's where there's a gap in the logic. That's where there's a gap, I would say, in the government's credibility. Again, one could go through Hansard and spend hours reciting some of the criticisms made by the Minister of Finance when he was a finance critic in opposition, by the Premier when he was leader of the official opposition. I believe even the member for Halifax, Shabukta, at one point was a critic for economic development and also spoke out repeatedly about this specific fund. Yet today, they sit here almost in silence, saying we've changed the name, but for all intents and purposes, we are going to be operating the fund in the same way. Now, to their credit, they said that being the Auditor General could not have access to certain documents under the existing rules. They did change those rules. But unless the Auditor General is going to be asked on a yearly basis to review the decisions made by Cabinet in regards to this new Nova Scotia Jobs Fund, who is the watchdog for Nova Scotia taxpayers? Because the opposition, we can't access those documents. We can put in freedom of information requests, all we're going to get is blanked out pages. So we can't do it because we can't have the information that Cabinet used to make their decisions. So the only person that can is the Auditor General. And the question I would have is the government prepared to amend this bill to put in it that the Auditor General will undertake a yearly audit of funding decisions made under the Nova Scotia Job Funds Act? I think that's a reasonable proposition. I think the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, if he wants to give Nova Scotians the assurance of transparency, if he wants to say, I need to keep confidentiality, but to give you assurance, I will ask the Auditor General in his office to conduct a yearly audit of this fund to give Nova Scotians the confidence that we're following the rules, investment decisions are being made on a reasoned basis, and that Nova Scotians are getting value for dollar under this fund. I believe that's a reasonable request to make. Speaking about it, I think it possibly could be an amendment brought forward. The government could do it itself, or maybe we'll be of assistance and provide it for them. But I think that would go a long way of providing a level of transparency into an individual, an officer of this legislature who is very trusted, to give us as the elected officials in opposition and to give Nova Scotians the sense that the decisions being made as to how their tax dollars will be used under this new job funds is going to be done in a prudent fashion. So, Madam Speaker, with those comments, I do believe there's more the government can do if they are truly interested in addressing the issues of transparency that were raised by the Auditor General, whether they're actually sincere in addressing the concerns raised by their own Minister of Finance a mere 2 years ago, that he did on a repeated basis, the concerns raised by the Premier when he was Leader of the Official Opposition, by the Member for Halifax-Chebucto, and a number of others. Because right now, as it now stands, this bill is a disservice to the criticisms that they made, which I truly believed at the time they were sincere in making them. But after 2 years in government, Bill 65, as it now stands, does not in any way show sincerity as to addressing the issues that they so vociferously raised when they were in opposition regarding the Industrial Expansion Fund. So, Madam Speaker, there is still time. I look forward to when this bill goes to law amendments. I would hope the Minister would take my proposed amendment under consideration, and I see no reason why that could not be adopted as a means of strengthening this. We have never suggested that government should not be investing in Nova Scotia businesses. The Tories did it when they were in opposition before 1999. The NDP did it when they were in opposition before they got elected. We have never suggested that. We see there is a role to be played there, but as well we see that over the passage of time there's better transparency and better accountability that should be put into place. Right now, as it now stands, Bill 65 does not achieve that. It takes baby steps, but there is still time to amend this bill to better reflect on the very concerns that have been raised and to better respect the concerns of Nova Scotians and their hard-earned tax dollars and how we spend it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the Honourable Minister for Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. It will be to close debate.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I stand in my place to close debate on Bill 65, and I also want to acknowledge all members in the House that spoke on this bill, and I listened with much interest, and as we move forward from here, I will say to the House and to all members that the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund is extremely different from anything that's ever been envisioned by any previous governments, and it will continue to do the good work on behalf of all Nova Scotians, and it will be much to the pleasure of all members of the House, Madam Chair.
The question is for second reading of Bill number 65, the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund Act. Is the House ready for the question? All in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 65, an act relating to the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, could you please call Bill number 72, the Timely Medical Certificate Act?
Thank you. I now call Bill number 72, the Timely Medical Certificates Act. I recognize the Honourable Minister for Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker. Sorry about that. Anyway, I now move that Bill 72 be read a second time. The other day in the bill briefing, Madam Speaker, I was remiss in identifying where this came from. My colleague, the member from Lunenburg, brought this forward. And actually, didn't necessarily bring it forward to me, but certainly I think my memory's right when my staff, executive director for Vital Statistics Division, Michelle McFarland, first briefed me on this. She identified the member for Lunenburg as that this was an initiative that came from her, and I had forgotten that during the bill briefing, and I was asked, where did this come from? And because it was thought that maybe it had come from nurse practitioners, and I said I thought it was an initiative of government, but I didn't pinpoint it. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge my colleague for her good work. Madam Speaker, Bill 72 introduces the Timely Medical Certificates Act, which will help grieving Nova Scotians in difficult circumstances. The death of a loved one is always painful, and the days immediately following the death are often especially difficult. Often with an expected death, families have been stretched for some time, emotionally, physically, and financially, before they reach this point. Madam Speaker, from the loss itself to making the necessary funeral arrangements to accommodating friends and family from away, it can all be very overwhelming. While the grief remains, families sometimes feel a sense of closure once the funeral or other arrangements are complete. Unfortunately, for some Nova Scotians, this process can be delayed. Madam Speaker, the funeral home cannot remove the body from the location of the death until the medical certificate of death has been signed by a doctor or a medical examiner. This is necessary in order to determine the cause of the death, but it can still be a hardship for loved ones. It also means that in some remote and rural areas of Nova Scotia, the body of a loved one could remain in their home until a doctor or medical examiner can be brought in to sign the certificate, causing even more distress for the family. Madam Speaker, the proposed Timely Medical Certificates Act would allow nurse practitioners and others authorized through regulation to sign medical certificates of death in certain circumstances. I've said authorized through regulation. So there will be some consultation, Madam Speaker. I think the medical examiner's office is interested, thinking that possibly some of their investigators, and also we have two paramedics, former paramedics in the House, who have indicated some interest that maybe paramedics might also take on that role. This means that families would be able to make arrangements more quickly following the death of their loved one. The department held consultations on the proposed amendment with stakeholders this past summer. The feedback from stakeholders was positive. Madam Speaker, further consultation has to take place around the regulations to determine the specific circumstances under which nurse practitioners and others authorized through regulation can sign the death certificate. The circumstances will then be detailed in the regulations. The ability to sign medical certificates of death will allow nurse practitioners to continue the strong relationship they have with their communities by supporting end-of-life care for patients and families. Nurse practitioners have advanced knowledge and skill in health assessment and diagnosis and work collaboratively with a physician. Madam Speaker, additional training will be provided in determining the cause of death and completing the necessary forms. In 2010-11, there were over 115 nurse practitioners licensed in Nova Scotia. Some are employed within the provincial health system in a variety of settings, including long-term care, community primary health care, and hospitals. Allowing these healthcare professionals to sign the certificate of death in certain situations will make a difficult situation a little easier for some grieving Nova Scotians. So, Madam Speaker, this change will make life better for Nova Scotians by supporting families who've lost a loved one. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to be able to rise and to say a few comments on Bill number 72, Timely Medical Certificates Act. And for those wondering why would the Justice Critic be up speaking on this, I would refer you back to question period earlier today. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But I do as well want to recognize the member for Lunenburg. I can tell you, having been a backbencher in government, it's not always a fun place to be. It can be lonely at times. No, I can say I wasn't in the backbench for long, and I wasn't in cabinet for long either, but in both instances. But certainly, I think there's always a very important role that backbenchers can play, and too often under the British parliamentary system, it makes it extremely difficult for government backbenchers to play as strong of a role in this House and outside of this House as what I think they could do. And I think that's something that we need to look at as the system that we have, because obviously it's an old system, and for life in the backbench, as I said, it's not always fun, and it's certainly very limiting as to what can be achieved when you're on the government side and required to support government decisions. But with that, I commend her for having brought this forward, and I think all Nova Scotians would see this bill as a positive move. I listened to the comments from the Minister of Service Nova Scotia about the desire to be able to find a more timely way of dealing with grieving families and the loss of a loved one. But I have to say, Madam Speaker, that flies in the face of a decision that was made by the Minister of Finance and by the Minister of Justice to limit what autopsies will be done by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Nova Scotia for the purposes of saving money. As I has indicated earlier, I find this to be an extremely tasteless decision by this government to tell grieving families, wait till Monday, because you don't fit into the categories that we have now decided of who gets to have an autopsy on the weekend and who doesn't. I can't imagine how the government somehow came up with this and thought Nova Scotians would see it as a good idea. At the end of the day, there are certain services that government is expected to provide to the residents of Nova Scotians that you simply cannot put a price tag on. To tell the Chief Medical Examiner that he cannot perform autopsies on the weekend unless they fit into the category as was outlined today in question period by the Minister of Justice, I have to say is one of the most unfortunate decisions that I've seen a government make in my time. And yet to turn around and bring in legislation at the very same time saying we want to allow nurse practitioners to sign death certificates because we don't want grieving families to wait. So we'll rush to make sure to assist in getting you a death certificate, but if the death was for unknown reasons and you don't fit into the specific criteria set out by the Minister of Justice, you have to wait till Monday morning. Now, Madam Speaker, the confusion in all this is that 2 weeks ago, I believe on a Wednesday, the Chief Medical Examiner's Office sent out a memo to embalmers and undertakers and crematoriums, I believe, to inform them of changes that were going to be made, including limits on autopsies performed during the weekend. Needless to say, there was an outcry, and by Friday afternoon, the Chief Medical Examiner had issued a statement to these very same embalmers and undertakers saying that they'd reversed their decision. And that's what we were under the belief of, that, and believe it or not, I was certainly prepared to tell the Minister of Justice, I think you were right in reversing that decision. I think it was a bad decision, and you quickly found the reaction, and good on you to have reversed it. But to my surprise, it was not reversed. The Minister of Justice instead stood in his place and said, here is who gets to have an autopsy on the weekend, and everybody else, wait till Monday morning. Now, what message does that send to Nova Scotia families who have lost a loved one for unknown reasons? There's no worse feeling for a family to have someone die suddenly and everyone left asking, what happened? Sadly, if it happened on a Friday night, a Saturday, or a Sunday, this Minister of Justice, under direction, I'm sure, of the Minister of Finance, is telling Nova Scotian, those families, wait till Monday, because we need to save a few bucks. That's what it comes down to. Wait till Monday so we can save a few bucks. The province of Nova Scotia right now, if I'm not mistaken, the Minister of Finance can correct me, but I believe it takes in approximately $9 billion in total revenue. This government has decided to try to save. The line item from the Minister of Justice indicates that he expects that the Chief Medical Examiner's Office is going to save $290,000 this fiscal year by implementing changes to current service levels and procedures. Will it all come from limiting autopsies? We're not sure. But when you're a $9 billion operation and you decide that you need to find money and need to reduce your spending, that you would look to the Office of Chief Medical Examiner and tell Nova Scotia grieving families, you got to wait till Monday morning because we need to save a few bucks. I can't see how anybody in this government could stand in their place and say that was a wise decision. And we think that that's the type of better deal for Nova Scotia families that we campaigned on. And that's why Nova Scotians voted for us. It was tasteless. I believe it falls into the category of even being reprehensible to tell Nova Scotia families to wait. It's one thing if the service was never provided, but it's another thing when they were used to this, where it was there to try to find answers for families, and now to save a few bucks, wait till Monday morning. And I will say again, as justice critic, I do feel bad for the Minister of Justice because I know the instructions for these changes is not coming from him, it's not coming from his department, it's coming from the Department of Finance and the Minister of Finance. Because Justice took, percentage-wise, probably the biggest cut of any department in government in the spring budget, $5.3 million. And that they would look to find savings in the Chief Medical Examiner's Office. The other irony in this, Madam Chair, is a few weeks ago, this summer, I joined the Minister of Finance and the Premier over in Burnside. Now, why were we in Burnside? Well, we were in Burnside for the sod turning of a new Chief Medical Office in Nova Scotia. A modern facility that is not only going to assist in the work of the Chief Medical Examiner, but I can tell you, due to my involvement in some of the decisions and some of the different meetings that took place that led up to this, it will not only enhance the services to the Chief Medical Examiner and everyone in his office, but it will provide a much more respectful place for grieving families who are forced to have to come to that office due to the death of a loved one. The system that we had previously in place was clearly outdated, was not very respectful of Nova Scotia families who had to have interaction with the Chief Medical Examiner after the loss of a loved one. But this new modern facility is going to be something Nova Scotians can be proud of. And death is not something that we often think of or that we debate about, but once you're impacted by it, we want to make sure as a province that we're providing the best level of service, the best level of compassion, and the best level of respect that we possibly can to grieving families. And I was proud, as an opposition member, to be at that sod turning and to clearly tell the media, we believe this is a wise investment of public funds. I attended when we went down with the former Minister of Justice, former member for Cape Breton North, and the Premier on behalf of the NDP opposition at the time. We went to see the Medical Examiner's Office in Miami-Dade. Florida. A modern facility, one of the busiest offices of a medical examiner in North America. And to see their operation and to see what we had, it was clear that an investment had to be made. So, sod turning first, wonderful announcement, brand new facility, enhanced services, better quality, better respect, better compassion, and yet in the budget, $290,000 cut to the office of the chief medical examiner. So this comes right back to the whole purpose of the bill that's before us, which, as the Minister of Justice indicated, was to, Minister of Service Nova Scotia, was to provide more timely response to Nova Scotia families who had lost a loved one. That directly ties into the services provided by the government when it comes to the Chief Medical Examiner's office. So, cut the budget, build a new facility, have the Minister of Service Nova Scotia say he's going to allow nurse practitioners to sign a death certificate on a more timely basis, and then tell Nova Scotians, unless you fit in a specific category set out by the Minister of Justice as to the type of death of your loved one, you have to wait till Monday because we want to save a few bucks on the weekend. That is the message that this government is giving, and it just doesn't add up. It just causes confusion because on one hand they're doing a great thing. On another hand, who can stand on the government side and say, when we campaigned for a better deal for Nova Scotia families, we thought limiting which families get to have a timely autopsy on the weekend and which ones don't was part of our plan for a better deal. This government still has time to reverse this decision. As more Nova Scotians find out, I know myself, when this first issue came out, I put out a press release on my own Facebook site. A wonderful thing. People just generally made comments, and they just couldn't believe. The comments were along the lines of, what is the government thinking? That you would find a way of saving money on the backs of the Chief Medical Examiner's office by telling Nova Scotia families, wait till Monday, because you don't fit into the specific criteria set out by the Minister of Justice. As I said, Madam Speaker, there is time to change this decision. What's even more bizarre about it is that if this was something the government really believed was a good way of saving money for Nova Scotia taxpayers, why is it then, very peculiarly, that the Minister of Justice says these changes are in effect till April 2012, which is the end of the fiscal year? So at that point, is the minister going to say, well, it's now a fiscal year, talk to the Minister of Finance, he had a change of heart, we're not going to resume the service? But we saved a few bucks during the last fiscal year by limiting who was going to be able to have an autopsy done on the weekend. So, as I said, Madam Speaker, this is an issue which I will continue to raise on behalf of Nova Scotians, on behalf of the Chief Medical Examiner's Office, which I have to say, having had the opportunity to meet our Chief Medical Examiner, Matt Bowes, the new Assistant Chief Medical Examiner, the very nature of their business is to get answers for families in a timely fashion. And that somehow we would tell them. Can you imagine us telling doctors, tell people to come back on Monday, don't treat them right away, don't find answers for them right away. Yet this is what's being said to this office. We're going to build a brand new building, modern facility, but we're going to limit as to what work they can actually carry out on weekends. Madam Speaker, nurse practitioners are playing a bigger and bigger role in our healthcare system. I can say that in Richmond County, we have Bonnie Sampson-Gagnon, who is operating out of the Kingston Clinic in Lardoise. She has been a tremendous addition to the healthcare of the residents of Richmond County. And it is something that I know that many of our communities are asking, how can we obtain the services of a nurse practitioner, and more Nova Scotians are showing confidence in finding alternative ways of getting the services which they so traditionally relied upon doctors before. So, Madam Speaker, I know that we're getting close to the end of time. I still have some remarks to make on this bill, so I would move that for the moment that we adjourn debate on bill number 72, and we can resume that debate on another day. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. We will ask you now to rise to be at the hours between 9 a.m. and 12 noon tomorrow, when we will resume debate on Bill 72. And if that concludes, we will move on to Bill 73. I wish you to now rise, Madam Speaker.
The motion is that the House does now rise to sit again tomorrow, November the 4th, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 12 noon. All in favour? Those opposed? The motion is carried. It's now the moment of interruption, and I now call under Rule 5.5, as read earlier today, resolution put forward by the Honourable Member for Inverness. That reads, therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly agree that the high-cost, job-killing policies of the NDP are to blame for the alarming amount of young people leaving